What's up, everybody? Today is New Year's Eve 2022, and I am super excited to show you something that I have been working on for my 67 Nova for more than a minute. I have finally finished my custom center console for this car. It really just turned out absolutely fantastic. You can see it right there in the car behind me, and I'm really proud of how it turned out. I'm just shocked at how long it took to build, and I'm going to go ahead and pull it out of the car right now and show it to you and just give you the cliff notes, quick pictures running through, showing you how I built this thing from start to finish. It turned out great, and so hopefully I can inspire somebody out there to build something, of your own. We'll see. So the first step was to take a photo of the inside of the car and, the transmission tunnel and everything. And then from there, I'd put it into the computer and just start drawing lines, trying to figure out the design and get an idea on paper of what I was trying to build. Next up, I would start cutting cardboard templates and taping those inside the car to kind of bring my design to life and make sure that what I envisioned was what I actually wanted. Once I had those templates taped inside the car, I would start drawing lines on the picture again to kind of further build everything out in my mind and make sure that I knew what I was about to build and I liked it. Once I had my cardboard templates cut and I liked them, I started building 1/4-inch round rod around those templates, and those pieces of 1/4-inch round rod would ultimately become the base of my console. And basically what I decided to do was to tack weld tiny little welds inside the car, holding those round pieces of rod into the car to form the base. I ultimately decided that, if I tried to build this thing over here on the workbench and then put it in the car, everything was just never going to line up the way that you wanted, so I decided I would ultimately build it in the car, and then once I had everything the way I wanted it, I would cut the little tack welds and pull everything out later. So at this point, it was time to go ahead and start building the wire frame that would ultimately become the top end of this thing. And I knew that it was going to be terribly important that those things match from side to side, so I built a template. I just used a piece of scrap plate and some scrap round tubing and welded them in place and then bent my 1/4-inch wire around those pieces. I did this so that I knew for sure both sides were going to be exactly the same. Pro tip on this, when you get your pieces into your template, before you pull them out, I recommend heating them with a torch at the corners. Get them good and red hot and then let them cool naturally. That way when you pull the parts out of your template, they don't go and all of a sudden try and expand to a different size. They remain the same size when you pull them out of your template. So once I had my wire pieces made to form the frame of everything and so forth, I started tack welding them together inside the car to form the frame. Of course, I already had the base of the frame in there, and so now I'm building on top of that. And this is a good time to point out that when you're building something like this, I don't recommend building it perfect on a bench and then putting it in the car, because if we're being totally honest, the manufacturing of cars from the 60s was just absolute garbage. If you make your console a perfect 37 inches on one side and 37 inches on the other and then put it in the car, it's not going to fit, because these cars are they're not any good. You may need 37 on one side and 37.25 on the other. So that's again why I'm building this thing inside the car. So basically I just tack welded the entire frame of this thing together inside the car. Once I had the frame made, then I just welded in a couple of pieces of 1/8-inch strip so that I could ultimately drill through the strip, through the transmission tunnel, and bolt the console into the car. Now that the frame was built inside the car, I just cut the little spot welds that hold it in place, as you see in the shot here, and then I pulled the frame out of the car, giving you ultimately what you see here. At this point, it was time to start sheeting everything in 18-gauge sheet metal. All I did for this was just got myself some poster board material and started carefully trimming templates that I would then transfer over into metal, and then naturally just weld those metal patches in place. At this point, it was time to mount my radio in place, and I didn't take any pictures of it, so I'll just show you right here. There we go. I welded some little threaded bungs in place that ultimately allowed everything to bolt in place where you have this faceplate radio. I'll flip it over and show you what I'm talking about. I decided that I wanted everything to be modular with these aluminum plates that everything would mount in. So when I got ready to mount my radio into it right here, I kind of cheated a little bit. I drew up the part that I needed in the computer, you know, again from a cardboard template, and then I cut it out in the CNC cutter until at the end of the day I had a perfect aluminum panel with a perfect little rectangular opening here for my radio as well as a USB charging port. It's worth mentioning that the reason that I did this and I decided to do an aluminum panel here and here and here is that everything is modular. If I decide at some point that I want to change something, I don't have to go just tearing everything out. If I end up wanting to do a different set of switches right here for my my power windows and my door locks, all I've got to do is just remake that little panel right there. And you know, same can be said for this panel here that houses my shifter, which has a button for my parking brake and then also my trunk popper. So everything was made so that it was modular. I can change my mind anytime and just remake an aluminum panel, bolt it right in, and you know, it makes everything really easy to modify later. So now it was time to go ahead and start covering everything in sheet, and again I just used some construction paper and cut out some templates from there. I cut out metal pieces, ran them through my English wheel to pre-stretch them so that I could ultimately bead roll them without causing a whole bunch of distortion, and then just went from one piece to the next, making my pieces and welding them to the outside of my 1/4 inch wire frame till the whole thing was covered. Onward I went to mounting the cup holder. This is just a universal cup holder that I picked up off of eBay, and again I kind of cheated and used the CNC cutter to make the mount for this thing. Now you will notice in this shot here how there's a mount in the car, and yet I'm holding the mount that looks almost identical. I had to make several variations of the mount for this thing before I finally got it right, got it mounted in the car, and finally got the cup holder in place. Here's a couple of shots where I'm again using the CNC cutter to make the little aluminum panel that all of my switches mount into. Now it's worth mentioning that when your CNC cutter makes something, it's going to make it absolutely perfect. For instance, it's going to make this line 100% parallel with this line. However, when I went to go take these panels and start putting them into the actual console that I built, that's when I realized that my console was not perfect, but my CNC part was. So what I actually ended up doing was coming in sometimes, and I might, for instance, I might cut this weld right here and then use a clamp to pull everything perfectly straight around my CNC part so that I can then weld my console together and ultimately make sure that my console there fits my CNC part absolutely perfectly, because it's just not realistic to think that you're going to make that console and it's going to be as accurate as that computer made part. It ain't happening. All right, here we go, cheating again. I got myself a little hardware store hinge right here that my door would ultimately pivot about. And yes, I used the CNC cutter and cut a piece of 1/8 inch out that would ultimately be the frame for my little door right here. Got everything welded in place, and then I also just put in some little magnetic, clasps again from Ace Hardware that would hold my little door down to where, it doesn't just try and flop around. Next up was to make some rails for this panel right here to mount to. So you'll notice in this shot that I've put some rails in place, and I've got a piece of scrap steel that is clamping them together. I'm doing this so that my rails are in one plane from one side to the other. Have a look at the next shot, and you'll notice I've put some rib nuts in so that at the end of the day, the little screws right here have something to screw into and hold everything down. The pistol grip shifter that I made is something that I'm really proud of in terms of how it turned out. So I got myself just an image of a pistol grip shifter off of a Google image search, drew that in CAD, and then cut out with the CNC cutter 3 pieces that were all identical, a 3/4 inch aluminum core and 2 1/8 inch outside pieces. From there, all I did was bolt all 3 of them together and then run a grinder across them to where they were all exactly the same profile, and then I powder coated the outside edges, bolted everything together, and that's what you got, is a custom pistol grip shifter. Probably my final step in fabrication was to make all of the seams of this thing nice and pretty, and so I had to weld that 18 gauge sheet onto that 1/4 inch frame. Lots and lots of welds had to be done, and then once it was all welded up, it had to be ground down with a flap wheel so that you ultimately had a nice smooth surface on everything. It took an amazing amount of time to do all of that welding and grinding to ultimately get it to look nice. Once I finally had all of the fabrication done, I put the entire console there into my REPP70 blast cabinet and blasted it down to bare metal. Next up, I used Alvin lab metal to fill in all of the imperfection in my welding. You've got to use that stuff or something similar because you cannot powder coat over regular Bondo, body filler. I have my own powder coating oven at home, as well as the Eastwood powder coating system, which they don't sponsor me. I have the Eastwood system that I use at home. No, they don't sponsor me. And then I just shot it in flat black powder. You wouldn't think it, but that shift boot ring right there probably took 5 or 6 hours alone to make. I cut it out of some thick aluminum using the CNC cutter, and then from there I put it in my lathe and turned down the outer edges and inside edges so everything was nice and straight. And from there it went into my mill where I milled the top side of it, took some material off just to make it a nice smooth finish, and on the back side I actually cut some material out so that my shift boot had some area to occupy space, so that at the end of the day, my shift ring did not sit up on top of the aluminum panel, but was actually flush, and yet there was room inside for the shift boot. From there, again, I powder coated it black just like everything else, and I thought this was pretty cool. I put it back into the lathe after I powder coated it so I could cut that little bitty, shiny aluminum ring that you see right there that runs through all of the bolts. So I actually did that and put it back into the lathe and did some more of the machining after it was powder coated, and at the end of the day, produced what I thought was a really cool looking shift ring. The only work on this console that I did not do myself was the interior work. So the suede shift boot right there, as well as the center armrest pad, I didn't make that stuff. That was made over at Jubilee Interiors in Fairhope, Alabama. They only charged $150 to make those two parts right there, and they got to it in about a month's time. So if you need somebody to do some good interior work on a hot rod, I would recommend checking them out. It's worth mentioning that I didn't really communicate to them as well as I should have what I wanted. They actually made the armrest right here not come out to the outside edges, and so as a result I have a little bit of a gap running along right there, so I might have them remake that part later when we do the entire car. I don't know, we can figure that out at a later time, but anyways, they do some nice work and it wasn't terribly expensive. So there you go, guys. The console is done. I did leave some extra space right here so that later I could come in there and install more switches for like my electric exhaust cutouts or my heated seats. So I've left extra space right there in case I want to mount other stuff there in the future, which is highly likely. But for now, it's done. Everything is done. If you want to make sure you don't miss any of my future videos, click subscribe. As a favor to me, please click the thumbs up down below and follow along with the rest of the 67 Nova build. I recently got the body welded onto the car, so for the first time ever, my quarters and roof and cowls and everything, it's all there. I'm in the process right now of trying to get my Fezler flush mount glass into, whoops, there we go. There it is, Fezler flush mount glass into the car. That's a lot more work than I ever dreamed it would be. You guys will hear about that in future videos. Anyways, appreciate you guys watching. Hope y'all learned something, and anyways, y'all take care, man. Thanks.